Assalamualaikum first year. Um, Today we will start with the body temperature regulation. But first I will introduce you to some uh, definitions. So what is the core body temperature? It is the temperature of the deep tissues of the body, which remains nearly constant under physiological conditions. It means that it does not fluctuate more than 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.6 degree centigrade. As far as the value is concerned, average core body temperature is taken to be around 98.6 degree Fahrenheit orally and 1 degree Fahrenheit higher when it is measured rectally. Uh, and you can see that it can be measured from rectum, but apart from that, it can also be measured from tympanic membrane, from the pulmonary artery, distal esophagus, and also from nasopharynx. Now, the core thermal component, that is composed of highly perfused tissues whose temperature is kept uniform and also high compared with the rest of the body. But keep in mind that this core body temperature, it gradually decreases with age. Now we move on to the skin temperature. The skin temperature, it rises and falls with the temperature of the surroundings, which you can also call the ambient temperature. Now this skin temperature, it can be measured by placing temperature sensors, which are also called thermistors. Now these temperature sensors, they are placed at skin at various locations, and then mean skin temperature, it can be calculated by measuring skin temperature at several locations and computing the average across these locations. And the thermistors, they are placed at which locations? These locations could be forehead, chest, thigh, calf, abdomen, and back. So you can see that what is the difference in core body temperature and skin temperature. Now you also know that the ambient temperature means the temperature of the surrounding. Now ambient temperature is the temperature at which there is no active heat loss or heat gain mechanism operated by the body, and its average value is around 27 degree centigrades, with a range of plus minus 2 degree centigrade. Now, how do we calculate our average body temperature? This average body temperature is used when one wishes to calculate the total amount of the heat which is stored in the body. And then we take almost 1/3 of the surface temperature, and we add 2/3 of the core body temperature or the internal temperature in that surface temperature, and this is how we get an average body temperature. Uh, Now, what is thermal gradient? You see, within the body, there is a difference between the core temperature and the skin temperature, or you can say the shell temperature. Now, this difference, that is called thermal gradient. And the ideal difference between the core and the skin temperature, that should be approximately 4 degrees centigrade. But you must also keep that in mind that even within the core, temperature, it could vary from one organ to another. So in extreme circumstances, the core temperature, it could be even 20 degrees centigrade higher than the skin temperature. And then comes the thermoneutral zone. I will introduce you to this thermoneutral zone when we will go through the concept of the constancy of body temperature. So let's move on to the thermoregulation. You see, the ability to maintain a nearly constant internal body temperature, which is core temperature, that is called thermoregulation. And in your school, you uh, might have known two terms, the warm-blooded and the cold-blooded, that the animals, they could be warm-blooded or cold-blooded. You see, the warm-blooded animals, they are also called homeothermic or the endotherms. These are the animals who can maintain a nearly constant core body temperature despite wide variations in the surrounding temperature, because their metabolic rate is very high, which is enough to keep their bodies warm. Mammals and birds, they are included in this class, and then come the cold-blooded animals, which are also called the ectotherms, or they are the actually poikilothermic organisms. These animals, they have rudimentary thermoregulation, and their core body temperature, it changes with the change in the ambient temperature. The examples of the cold-blooded animals, they are fish, reptiles, and amphibians. Usually their metabolic rate is too low to warm their bodies. Now, there are not only these two classes, but there is also a special class of heterotherms, which can switch between the poikilothermic and the homeothermic strategies. Well, now we will see that how the temperature can be recorded, and from where the body temperature can be recorded. So the sites for the temperature recording, these are mouth, axilla, rectum, um, then lower one third of esophagus, and tympanic membrane, and of course the skin temperature, that is taken from the skin. But we are more concerned with the temperature of brain. You see, the rectal temperature, that is not the same as the temperature in the brain, where the temperature is regulated. So there comes the importance of the tympanic temperature, which is a good estimate of the actual brain temperature. Now, for recording temperature, there are several devices which are used. For example, the mercury thermometers, which you are familiar with. Then come the thermocouples and the thermistors. And there are also ingestible core temperature pills. Now, how do these pills work? They actually use low power radio frequency transmissions to communicate with the temperature monitor. Well, as far as the classification of temperatures is concerned, temperatures can be classified from very cold to very hot, varying between from very cold to cold, and then it becomes cool, and then there is a range where the temperature becomes neutral, and then it rises up to warm and hot and very hot. We call the temperature very hot when it reaches beyond 104 degree Fahrenheit, and we will call it very cold when it falls below 32 degree Fahrenheit. And between the range of 80 degree Fahrenheit to 92 degree Fahrenheit, the temperature is considered neutral, right? Now we will see that if the body heat has any relationship with the temperature. Let me tell you that the temperature of an object that is the measure of the kinetic activity of its molecules, and this is proportional to the amount of the heat which is stored in the object. So we can say that body temperature is directly proportional to the heat in the body. So what is this heat capacity? Or you can call it specific heat. You see, this is a measurement of the changes in the body heat stores which are utilized to characterize the temperature regulation quantitatively. Now, this heat capacity, it can be defined as the ratio of heat supplied to the corresponding temperature rise. Or you can also define this specific heat as the ratio of the heat removed to the corresponding temperature fall. And then you can use this formula to calculate the specific heat. You see that body temperature, it increases 1 degree centigrade for each calorie of heat stored per kilogram of body weight, and the specific heat of tissues, that is said to be around 0.83 calorie per kilogram per degree centigrade. Now I told you that I will introduce you to the concept of thermoneutral zone. This thermoneutral zone is a range of the environmental temperatures in which the body temperature, it can be maintained by adjustment of skin blood flow alone. For a nude human, this thermoneutral zone, it lies between 25 degrees centigrade to 31 degrees centigrade. And we will see increased metabolic rate and vasoconstriction below this thermoneutral zone, while above this thermoneutral zone, sweating will occur. If you look at this figure, which shows the effect of high and low atmospheric temperatures of several hours duration on the internal body core temperature, you can conclude from this graph that in general, a nude person in dry air, which is between 55 degree to 130 degree Fahrenheit, that person is capable of maintaining a normal body core temperature, which will be somewhere between 97 degree to 100 degree Fahrenheit. Look at the heat producing and heat losing factors. Heat producing factors include basal metabolism and some extra metabolism. The basal metabolism, as the name is implying, that is the metabolism of all the cells of body, while the extra metabolism is caused by increased chemical activity of all the cells, for example in case of fever. And in addition to that, it includes shivering and the muscle contraction, thyroxine and growth hormone, and also epinephrine, norepinephrine, the sympathetic stimulation, even the digestion and absorption of food, that is included in extra metabolism. Uh, if we talk about the heat loss, then you see, heat is lost in two steps. That is from body core to the skin and from skin to the atmosphere. You already know that the blood vessels, they are distributed profusely beneath the skin, and especially important is a continuous venous plexus which is supplied by the inflow of blood from the skin capillaries. um, and then in most exposed areas of the body, such as in hands and feet and ears, blood is also supplied to the plexus directly from the small arteries through highly muscular arteriovenous anastomosis. So this is how a high rate of skin flow that causes the heat to be conducted from the core to the skin with great efficiency. And in addition to that, blood is very effective in this function because of its high capacity to store heat. And for all these reasons, skin is considered as an effective yet controlled heat radiator system. Now, if you look at this figure, uh, this shows the normal resting tone of the cutaneous blood vessels. And you know that alpha adrenergic receptors, they when they are stimulated, then there is contraction of the vascular smooth muscles. So in case of the sympathetic stimulation which takes place below the ambient temperature of 75 degree Fahrenheit, we see vasoconstriction. And if the ambient temperature that goes above 115 degree Fahrenheit, then we see maximum vasodilation of the cutaneous blood vessels. So you can see that how effective is the skin radiator system, because it shows eightfold difference in the heat conduction between the maximum dilation and the maximum constriction of the blood vessels. So in short, we can say that skin, it behaves as an effective and controlled heat radiator system, and the flow of the blood to the skin, that is the most effective mechanism for the heat transfer from the body core to the skin. Now I will tell you the basic physics of how heat is lost from the skin surface. You see, there are certain mechanisms through which heat is lost, and these are radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Uh, the first three of these mechanisms, they require a temperature gradient to exist between skin and the environment. Now, what is radiation? You see, radiation is a mode by which the heat can be lost from a hot to a cold object in the form of infrared rays. And 60% of total heat loss that occurs through radiation. Um, and you know that sun transfers its heat to the earth. So we conclude that the radiation, it can also take place in the vacuum. Just like our body, it can also gain heat via the radiation on a hot sunny day. Now, what is conduction? You see, conduction means the loss of heat from the body to the solid objects due to the direct contact. And keep in mind that 3% of body's heat loss that takes place through conduction, but the conduction from the solid objects to the air, that constitutes around 15% of heat loss. Moving on to convection. Convection causes the heat loss by the movement of air. And you should know that whatever heat is lost by the body, it is taken away by the convection currents. So if the surrounding air is cooler than the body, then heat can be lost very easily. Now we will look at a scenario of conduction and convection in when someone is immersed in water. You should know that the specific heat of water, that is far greater. So that means that per unit volume of the water, it can absorb much more amount of heat as compared to the air. In addition to that, the heat conductivity in the water, that is far greater. So as a result, it is impossible to heat the thin layer of water which is next to body. And if the temperature of the water, that is below body temperature, then the heat loss from the body, that is very rapid. And similarly, water's effectiveness in cooling, that is about 25 times greater than that of air at the same temperature. Now, what effect clothing has on this conduction and convection? You should know that clothing can increase the thickness of the private zone of air which is adjacent to skin. So heat loss, it can be reduced by a decreasing rate of conduction and convection, but the effectiveness of clothing in maintaining the body temperature, that is almost completely lost if the clothing becomes wet. Right, so now we move on to evaporation. This is the only way to lose heat when the temperature of the surrounding, that is greater than the temperature of body. Uh, mm, and how does evaporation produces cooling? Because for each gram of water or sweat which evaporates, uh, around 0.58 kilocalories, they are lost from the body in the form of heat. And then some heat is being continuously lost by the skin in even in the low ambient temperatures, and this loss is called insensible loss. Even a mild evaporation, it continues from the respiratory tract during the process of respiration even. And if we want to know the heat production, then the rate of the heat production at rest is around 1.5 kilocalories per minute, and when someone exercises, it rises to 15 kilocalories per minute. Mm-mm. Now, this process of evaporation of the sweat from the skin, uh, this is dependent on certain factors, and these factors are the ambient conditions and the convection currents around the body. Even the amount of the skin, even skin surface, that which is exposed to the environment, that also is a factor on which the rate of the sweating, that is dependent. And if we talk about the ambient conditions, that will include the air temperature and the relative humidity. If the relative humidity is high, it will reduce the rate of evaporation, because in this situation the vapor pressure gradient between the skin and environment, that is reduced. So we can say that if humidity is high, it will limit the sweat evaporation, and if the humidity is low, then this condition is ideal for sweat evaporation and the heat loss. All right. Uh, so what is this concept of heat balance? Our body, it achieves heat balance when the rate of heat production, that is exactly equal to the rate of heat lost. So for to achieve this heat balance, our body has got an insulator system and a radiator system. The insulator system, it consists of skin, subcutaneous tissue, and the fat in the subcutaneous tissue. While the radiator system, that is basically the flow of the blood to the skin. You must know that the skin temperature, that is very important in heat transfer to the environment, and the delivery of this heat to the surface, that is blood flow dependent. So to achieve this heat balance, our body has got it has got some effectors which help in altering the body temperature, and these effectors, they include the sweat glands and the smooth muscles around our arterioles, also the skeletal muscles, and some endocrine glands, especially the ones which are releasing thyroxine and epinephrine. Since we are talking about the effectors which alter the body temperature, so why not let's talk about the most important of these effectors, which are the sweat glands. Our autonomic nervous system controls the sweat glands, and specifically cholinergic nerve fibers. They supply these glands. And let me tell you that the primary excretions of these glands, they are rich in electrolytes, but the secondary excretions, they are the excretions in which very little amount of electrolytes is present. Actually, what happens that in an acclimatized person, a person who is acclimatized to hot weather, a very little amount of sodium chloride, that is lost in sweat, and that is due to the release of aldosterone, which is responsible for salt and water conservation. In case of lower animals, heat loss by panting is more effective. Because many lower animals, they have very little ability to lose heat from the surfaces of their bodies, because the surfaces, they are usually covered with the fur, and also because the skin of most lower animals, that is not supplied with the sweat glands. So substitute mechanism, the panting mechanism, that is used. So what happens in this panting mechanism, that the phenomenon that is turned on by the thermoregulator centers of the brain. How is that achieved? When the blood, it becomes overheated, the hypothalamus, that initiates the signals to decrease the body temperature, and one of these signals that initiate panting. Uh, and the actual panting process, that is controlled by a specific panting center in the pons of these lower animals. So I mentioned the mechanism of acclimatization. So now we will see that uh, What happens to the sweating mechanism during the acclimatization? You see that when a person is exposed to hot weather for several weeks, uh, he progressively sweat more and more profusely. Mm, you see that at first that person uh, sweats about 1.5 liters per hour, but this rate of sweating it rises to a double within 10 days, and then it still rises to about 2.5 times as much within 6 weeks. And this change of acclimatization that is caused by a direct increase in the sweating capability of the sweat glands themselves. Um, the second change which takes place in the acclimatization is the decreased concentration of sodium chloride in the sweat, and that is done for the better conservation of body salts. So, as a result, after 4 to 6 weeks of acclimatization, the loss of sodium chloride it may be as little as 3 to 5 grams per day. Now, you might be wondering about the mechanism of sweat excretion. Actually, what happens, which you can see in this figure, that the excretory portion of the sweat gland, this portion creates a fluid which is called primary excretion or precursor excretion. And then the concentrations of the constituents in the fluid, they are modified as this fluid flows through the duct. Keep in mind that the precursor excretion that is an active excretory product of the epithelial cells which are lining the coiled portion of the sweat gland, and cholinergic sympathetic nerve fibers which and on or near the glandular cells they elicit this excretion. So this is how sweat is secreted. Now let's revise briefly the mechanisms which are used for heat production by our body. The first one is the BMR. So, what is this BMR? It is basically the minimum amount of heat which is produced when a person is physically and mentally relaxed. And most of this BMR heat it is produced by liver, heart, muscle, skin, brain, endocrine organs, and some other tissues. And how this BMR is affected with the temperature. With each degree rise in temperature, there is a 13% increase in the BMR. Now, the second mechanism is the muscular exercise or shivering, which produce much more heat. Uh, uh, as you see during exercise around 90% of the heat that is produced by muscles, and as far as shivering is concerned it starts when the surrounding temperature falls to around 23 degrees centigrade. Now the process of shivering that is controlled by the somatic division of our nervous system. Uh, then thermogenesis could be diet induced also, because the food intake it increases the basal metabolic rate and hence the heat production. And the important thing is that diet induced thermogenesis that is more marked with the protein diet. Skin exposure, it can also cause the absorption of heat when the ambient temperature is higher than the body temperature. And then comes the brown fat. You see, in animals and in infants, this brown fat, this can be mobilized to produce heat whenever needed. Now, what is the rate of this metabolic heat production? Uh, Keep in mind that increased metabolic activity uh, that produces heat instead of energy or ATP. But this thing applies only to endotherms. And then there is a factor which affects the rate of the heat production, and that is the brown adipose tissue metabolism. Because the fat cells, they have high concentration of mitochondria to generate the heat, and for the same reason, you might have observed that the newborns, they do not shiver because they have many of these brown fat cells. So that was all about the heat production factors and heat losing mechanisms. Next time, we will look into the you see in the temperature regulating centers and the temperature detectors in detail. So till then, take care, stay home, stay safe.